José Guadalupe Posada Aguilar, better known as José Posada, was born in Aguascalientes, Mexico in 1852. And in the 1860s he had some formal instruction in drawing at the municipal academy in the town. By 1871, when he was 19 years old, he was apprenticed to a print workshop, and it was while working there that he learned about lithography, wood engraving and printing with metal type. And his illustrations soon featured in a lot of the printed material generated by the company. A year later the business relocated to León, Guanajuato, but not long after the move the owner returned to Aguascalientes and left Posada in charge as his manager. At which point he married, started a family and continued to manage the printing business successfully for the next 16 years. During this period he illustrated and produced all manner of graphics, including a large amount of religious material, printed as both lithographs and wood engravings. But this run of stability and success ended abruptly in 1888 when a flood damaged the workshop beyond repair. He subsequently moved to Mexico City, where he worked for the publisher Antonio Vanegas Arroyo, whose books and magazines were popular throughout Mexico and Spanish-speaking parts of the USA. Arroyo realized that Posada's talent for editorial illustration and the means by which it could be reproduced made him the perfect candidate to become one of his leading illustrators. The majority of Posada's work during this period appeared in leaflets and books, some of which were collections of song lyrics, but there were others on a range of topics. They were printed usually as monochrome, and there were also examples where a second colour was applied, although never anything more than that. And a large volume of Posada's illustrations were also published as what we call broadsides, printed on a single poor quality newsprint sheet. At the time they were immensely popular throughout Mexico, and it was this work, and particularly the many calaveros images he created, which brought him wider public recognition and popularity. Caballeros were pictures of living skeletons, and Posada created many for any number of contexts, frequently but not exclusively comical. And it's now generally acknowledged that they made a significant contribution to the imagery widely associated with Mexico's annual Day of the Dead. When the Mexican Revolution began in 1910, Posada began creating images which supported the Zapatista revolutionaries. Some of these also utilized his skeletal characters, but most were of a more journalistic nature. But he didn't do this for long, as Posada died in 1913 at the age of 60 due to his lifelong prodigious consumption of alcohol. I'm fairly disappointed to report that all I could find about German illustrator Paul Rieth was about 100 grudging words of biography on German Wikipedia. The entry states that he was born in 1871 in Persneck in central Germany, and he later studied sculpture at the Munich Academy, followed by more study in drawing and painting at Karlsruhe. The available visual evidence shows that once he'd completed his studies, he worked both as a painter and an illustrator with success for the rest of his career. The earliest examples of his illustration work I found are from Jugend magazine from the later 1890s. And from that point onward, the vast majority of his illustrations were created for its covers and pages. As an illustrator he was diverse in his approach. When working in monochrome he created his images directly onto lithographic stone, but even so he varied his techniques from the lightest of descriptive drawing through to more brutalist graphic expression. And the same was true of his early colour work for the magazine. But as the 20th century got underway, it seems Rieth also began creating his illustrations as paintings in both oils and watercolour, and was equally diverse with the mood and purpose of the images he produced. Between 1914 and 1916, a series of posters he designed for London Transport were published, despite the fact that Germany was at war with Britain. The first few in the series appeared before war was actually declared, but others were printed long after hostilities began. So I can only imagine he had actually created the whole series prior to the outbreak of war, and they just carried on printing them in subsequent years. But whatever the circumstances of this major commission, the scenic images of destinations he created were rendered in a powerful flat posterized style not seen in any of his other work. During the war he also produced a lot of propagandist material in Jugend, which, like other German publications, had inevitably aligned itself with the state's commitment to war. But unlike most of his contemporaries, his images were generally free of the usual vilification of the enemy and concentrated on more upbeat patriotic imagery. Following the end of the war, his association with Jugend continued as before, and other than a couple of less than cheerful images reflecting the misery of post-war Germany, it seems he opted to highlight the frivolous and more hedonistic lifestyle of those wealthy enough to bypass the suffering of the majority at the lower end of the social scale. His images from this time suggest that for some at least, life was one long party. But Paul Rieth died in Munich in 1925 when he was only 51 years old, so it looks like his own party was over sooner and more suddenly than anticipated. And how such a talent has become so forgotten, I can't begin to imagine. Unfortunately, Henri Morin is just as poorly recorded as Paul Rieth, so this profile will be equally lacking in biographical substance. He was born in Strasbourg in eastern France in 1873, and he later studied art in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts. From 1897, he became one of the most significant contributors to the children's magazine Mon Journal, one of the earliest in France to be printed in full colour. And the many narrative ink and watercolour wash illustrations he created for the magazine seem to have kept him fully occupied for several years to come, although there is also a small amount of evidence of some poster and postcard creation from this time too. In 1910 he illustrated Jérôme Doucet's book, The 12 Daughters of Queen Mab, using the same line and wash technique, and it was popular enough to merit publication in Britain 2 years later, translated into English. But there follows a decade in which I can find little printed evidence of his work, other than a series of engaging humorous postcards with historical themes published as an advertising campaign for a brand of champagne. But in 1920 he published the book Little Heroes of the Great War, and by the early 1920s he was working regularly for La Semaine de la Suzette, a popular girls' comic. In its pages he illustrated many stories with a large volume of sequential vignetted images about the young girl Nain, written by André Lichtenberger. All these images clearly indicated Morin's prowess as a narrative illustrator and creator of highly plausible figure work, and they were popular enough to be subsequently published as 13 books between 1924 and 1937. In 1924, his collection of colour images for the fairy stories, titled Les Contes Blancs, was also published, and this seems to have triggered a period of immense productivity, in which he produced an avalanche of similar bookwork throughout the rest of the decade and into the 1930s. Among them were Morin's edition of the 17th century Fable de La Fontaine, published in 1925. And in 1927 he created monochrome ink drawings for Charles Lamb's Tales of Shakespeare. In this period he also designed line-illustrated covers for several books written by the Comtesse de Ségur, but I haven't managed to find any evidence of actual page illustrations. In the late 1920s and early 30s, Morin also created quite a lot of religious work for children, and in 1934 a popular children's edition of the story of Don Quixote was also published, featuring a series of evocative colour illustrations. The last dated work I found was the last of the Nain books in 1937, when he would have been 64 years old. Whether he retired around this time I don't know, but he died in Versailles in 1961 when he was 88, at which point he seems to have been completely forgotten. Mabel Lucie Attwell was born in London in 1879 into an affluent middle-class family, and in her late teens she went on to study at both Heatherley's and St Martin's School of Art. But like many with illustrative ambitions, she wasn't comfortable with the formal classical nature of the teaching, and she left before completion. She quickly found her feet as an illustrator and almost immediately began selling work to several popular magazines, including The Tatler and Bystander. In 1908 she married the illustrator Harold Earnshaw, who's already featured in Unsung Heroes 72. and in 1910 she was offered a highly prestigious and financially rewarding commission to illustrate a series of gift books. The first of these was Mother Goose, for which she created a collection of attractive pen and watercolour images to illuminate the various verses. And she followed that with an adaptation of Alice in Wonderland for younger children in 1911. And although it was far from a faithful visualisation of the darkly surreal original, her illustrations were nevertheless possessed of the light pictorial charm with which she had forged her reputation. Her visualisation of Hans Andersen's fairy tales was published in 1914 and proved a good fit for her light graphic touch and child-friendly outlook. And so did her next project, an edition of Charles Kingsley's Water Babies in 1915. And with the popularity of these books, she took her place as one of Britain's most successful children's illustrators. In 1914, Harold Earnshaw had enlisted in the army and been sent to fight in France. But Mabel's career continued to spiral in popularity with what was now the predominantly female population of Britain and their offspring. During the years of the Great War, her illustrations were also used on a number of charming posters for London Transport, promoting travel to Christmas pantomimes and other events for youngsters. Harold survived the war but had been badly injured, although he did return to illustration in a much diminished capacity. But his wife had become an unstoppable force in children's publishing, and many more books, such as 1921's rewrite of J. M. Barrie's Peter Pan and Wendy, were published. Attwell's illustrations even caught the attention of Queen Maria of Romania, who invited her to spend several weeks at the Royal Palace in Bucharest in 1922. And she subsequently illustrated 2 stories written by the Queen, which were published with success in Britain and mainland Europe. In 1925 she created an edition of Retold Grimm's fairy tales, and yet again her visualisation played down and even removed the more menacing aspects of some of the stories. Her ongoing popularity with young mothers led inevitably to offers of advertising work, and her illustrated posters for household products were a common sight on the streets of Britain. She also capitalised on her celebrity status with many greetings cards and series of postcards which sold in large numbers throughout her career. And by the middle 1920s, her images of cute toddlers were also appearing as branded merchandise, from children's chinaware through to household fabrics. In 1937, Harold died as a consequence of his wartime injuries at the age of only 51. But his widow soldiered on, and her illustrations continue to find favour with later generations of children and their mothers into the 1960s. And Mabel Lucie Attwell died in 1964 at the age of 85. That's it for this one, and I hope you'll be back for the next.